Hello, and welcome to this panel. Thank you for joining us, which is analysing and improving the focus on the S, so the social in ESG. I'm Rachel Dobbs. I am a news editor and writer for The Economist, where I mostly focus on climate change. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Diane Gilhooley, who is the global co-head of ESG and the Global Practice Group Head of Employment, Labour and Pensions at Eversheds Sutherland, and Sally Smith, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Upfield. Just very quickly to start, I'm going to ask both of our panellists to outline what their company does and very briefly their role within that company, and then we will go from there. So Diane, if we could go to you first.
Thank you very much. Well, Eversheds Sutherland is a global law firm with offices across the world and lawyers working across the world on a wide variety of different practice areas.
Great. And Sally?
Yeah, hi. So I work for Upfield. We're a plant-based food company, the biggest plant-based food company in the world. We sell brands like Violife cheese. So we play in the plant-based cheese, spreads, butters and creams market with brands across the world.
Great. Thank you. So just to sort of kick us off, social is obviously an extremely broad term that could kind of be applied to almost anything and is often kept sort of deliberately vague. So to begin, I would like to ask you how you think of what the S means for your work and in your field, and, you know, with it as concrete examples as you can give in the work that you do. So, yeah, what are you trying to measure? How are you thinking about it? If we start with Sally.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic because people are at the forefront of all of this, right? So from an Upfield perspective, the S comes into our thinking and the way in which we approach and integrate sustainability into what we do every day in a number of different ways. Within our strategy, we, like many companies, have a people pillar that deals with how we think about and what we're trying to do in terms of the way in which we operate across wide stakeholder groups. So for the 4,000 plus upfielders that we have around the world, the communities that we operate in, and the people in our extended supply chains that we work with, from farmers at one end of the spectrum to the amazing work that chefs do to inspire a shift towards more plant-based diets. So people are core and central to our strategy, but we're a food company fundamentally. And so our biggest social impact is through the products that we sell. It's through the tasty food and hopefully inspiring more people to choose plant-based food, to grow the positive impact that plant-based sector can have within the food sector, which is going to be essential to tackling some of those big challenges that the world faces, whether it's climate change, biodiversity loss, and human health. So S infuses the totality of what we do and how we think about it, the targets we set, and the way in which we operate.
So thank you. And I definitely think that the idea of in how S plays into the impact that sort of companies' products or sort of end services has is very interesting and is something I want to return to later. But just to come quickly to Diane, I know that you have a slightly different perspective because you sit in a slightly different position. So yeah, if you could take us through how you think about the S and what it means to you.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about it, I think about it in probably two ways, and it's very similar to what we've just heard. You know, what is it? And who is it? There's probably those two areas. So in terms of what is it, I'd be thinking of it in the sense of business and human rights and the social impact a business could have in those areas, forced labour, modern slavery, health and safety, working conditions, well-being, those types of areas, diversity, equity, inclusion, all under that people pillar that we've just heard about as well, ethics, conduct, supply chain responsibilities, where do they sit, who has that responsibility, governance, stewardship, so it'd be that type of activity, board diversity. And so that would be the really, what is it, what comes within social, and then who is it? And it goes back to the discussion that we've just heard really there, which is it's a wide range of people. So it could be employees, but that's direct and indirect. It could be the customers, it could be the communities, the clients, those in the supply chain, and those affected, as you know, as we were just hearing then, by the product or the service that's delivered. So very much when I'm thinking of it, it's around what is it and who's impacted by it.
Great. And I'd actually like to pick up on the kind of responsibility point that you just mentioned there, because obviously when you were coming from a legal perspective, you were trying to make sure that, obviously alongside other things, but you're trying to make sure that practices align with, quite clearly set out laws. But one of the things that I am curious about is the extent to which both of you think that in terms of social issues, companies, like, how big is the scope of companies' responsibility? Is it enough to be abiding by the sort of general norms or laws that society has, or do companies have a responsibility to try and sort of set out their stall? This is what we want to do. This is what we stand for, which I guess is kind of surpassing or setting expectations. Whoever wants to go first.
So maybe I can start by talking a little bit about how we think about it at Upfield. So obviously we're a food company and we're first and foremost there to provide tasty products to people, right? We want people to choose our products. But behind that, because we're a plant-based food company, what we know we're able to do is offer a product that comes with benefits. It comes with benefits both for the planet. So take a plant-based butter, which has a lower climate impact, uses less water, uses less resources to make, as well as having lower saturated fat, and some of our products come from plant sterols, so you have a health benefit. So when we think about that responsibility, our primary responsibility, yes, is around, abiding by the food safety requirements and laws in countries. But to inspire people to shift, they're going to have to want and desire great food, and for us to grow, we need to be offering more than a product that is legally compliant. It doesn't entice people in. And if we're going to take on that bigger responsibility as a company to inspire that shift to more plant-based foods, which we know is essential to tackle the climate crisis, we know that the way in which we eat, particularly in the global north, isn't sustainable in the future. That responsibility it is important to think beyond the basics. And at a human level, people want to choose good stuff, right? So how do we inspire, how do we reach customers and consumers with products that they really, really want to buy? They have to be affordable, they have to be available, they have to be in the right place at the right time. And so that's why we work with people across the world to try and make that come to life in people's daily lives and homes.
Diane, I very much want to come to you in a moment, but just one extension here for Sally. I guess just over the course of recent years, how much have you noticed a sort of shift in the benefits for companies to have these kind of very moral statements or positions? And I mean, talking on a sort of self-interested basis, how much do you feel it's something that consumers are increasingly looking for in the choices that they make?
So I think consumers choose products in the food sector for lots of different reasons. A lot of them in the current climate choose food because they can afford it, because it's readily available and it's accessible. A lot of them choose it because they are looking for a healthy product or a product that doesn't use animals, growing category of consumers. And some of them choose it because they do care about the planet. But we know the biggest drivers tend to be taste and affordability and then health. And so from our perspective, trying to make sure that our brands appeal to consumers for different reasons are formulated to meet those underlying propositions so that they taste great, perform brilliantly, and deliver on some of those broader benefits that people are inspired to use them is crucial and critical. I'm not sure whether that quite answers your question. But...
No, it does. And it makes sense that you've got to hit all of those various marks. In a kind of like a hierarchy of needs way, almost.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily perceive it as a kind of moral position or imperative. The nature of our company is we're a plant-based food company, and the benefit of that for society is that it comes with a lower impact. So it isn't us about holding very tightly a sort of a lecturing tone with our consumers, because that doesn't tend to work to attract people to what you're doing. It's about how we utilise those benefits to really inspire people to choose our products over other ones.
Yeah. Coming to Diane, yes, so the earlier question of what do you see in your work as the kind of division between companies needing to be proactive or reactive in terms of sort of responding to or setting social issues or agendas? Agendas is possibly the wrong word, but
I think when they're looking, and just coming on to that discussion you've just had as well, I think businesses aren't just looking at legal compliance. And legal compliance is hard. I think there's sometimes an assessment, isn't there? Legal compliance is the easy part to do, or the baseline. So legal compliance is hard for businesses. And I think it's hard because they're working in multiple jurisdictions and they're covering lots of areas. So legal compliance itself is not straightforward. But of course, in many ways, legal compliance is what you start with. And then the reporting that people have to manage now is what they finish with. But in the end, you have everything else. You have all the interests of the stakeholders. You have the customers, the consumers that we were just hearing about there. So you have to have something bigger than that is guiding you, and that's your strategy and that's your mission. So a lot of the decision making then will sit around, how does this align with the strategy? How does this fit with the mission? How does this fit with what the business is going to achieve in relation to this? And the social impact, the interesting thing about the social impact on that is the fact that there haven't been metrics around it to date, not consistent metrics, making it harder for it to be measured, but it shouldn't make it harder for it to be discussed at that board or corporate level. So the social factors and the social impact, the real question for me is, are people having a discussion when they're having these broader based discussions? Are they having a discussion about their strategy and about the social impact of a decision they're about to make? Because when we look at those E or the S or the G combination of ESG, the outcome and the debate won't always be aligned. When you focus on the outcome on E, it won't necessarily get you to the same place as the outcome on S and social impact on people and business decisions. So I think that broader impact is really important. So when you're asking about the moral imperative, it's more around consider broader impact of a business beyond legal compliance.
And yeah, I absolutely agree. And you mentioned there the idea of kind of legal compliance being difficult, but also the problem of metrics and the problems of kind of regulations. And I'm coming from I predominantly look at climate change, so I am, very aware of the frameworks in place for businesses, like over those kind of disclosures. And as much as it's a difficult proposition, they are in some ways very simple, right? Emissions are something that can be exactly quantified. It's a sort of numbers in, numbers out equation. It can be measured, it can be disclosed. And you're absolutely right that there hasn't traditionally been a kind of equivalent for this in the social space. Is that something that either of you have seen emerging recently, or are there any kind of recent or incoming regulatory changes that you think will actually start having an impact on that kind of problem?
I'm happy to sort of pick up on some of the things that we're seeing here. I think there is a lot more happening around this space at the moment, and we're seeing a sea change on this in terms of expectation, particularly across Europe. So across Europe, what we're seeing there is we're seeing new European directives. So we're seeing the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the expectations there. We're seeing different local laws being reviewed, considered, enacted across a number of countries in Europe. So those expectations are there and are increasing, and the reporting obligations around that are increasing, and they will be looking at not the E and the G factors, albeit they're embedded as well, but they're also asking for reporting on a number of S-based factors. So you may well be looking in relation to those things around, what are the incentive schemes for management to actually embed their activity and embed their objectives? What's the diversity like? What are the worker conditions in relation to this and worker rights? So we are beginning to see that coming through, and that's just the beginning. I think it will follow up with there's follow-up directives coming as well. So there is more of a framework that is coming here for businesses to manage around S factors in particular.
And just taking the example of the Corporate Sustainability Directive in Europe, just could you give us a very brief précis of what you think the big takeaway from that is for viewers who might not be familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to expect lots of information, and it's going to expect information on people-based issues, so real reporting. So where in the past we haven't had that consistent metric approach, this is going to lead to much greater consistency of reporting, and it will be looking at things around what are the sustainability related incentive schemes for management, what is the diversity of the management board, and what's the reporting looking like on that, what is the representation and worker voice on management bodies. So are we actually hearing from the people within our businesses, and how are you doing that? So reporting on that. How are you taking account of the interests and the views of stakeholders, asking for that? How's it being taken into account? So it's really looking at a number of those broader-based people covered within the social impact, looking at those things, and then also looking at reporting around working conditions, equity, diversity, inclusion, and other work-related rights. And it's going to impact businesses in a variety of ways. So even where they're not directly obliged to report themselves, they may well be indirectly affected if they're part of a value chain of a company that does have to report. So they may well have to be part of those reporting obligations of that other business. So I think it will affect businesses in a fairly broad way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Sally, have there been any sort of regulatory changes or things on the horizon that have kind of quite concretely influenced the work that your company does, that Upfield does, and the way that it sort of thinks about stuff? Or, does it, what you're doing already flow into this sort of quite easily?
Yeah, so I think companies that have followed existing frameworks for reporting, so for example, the Global Reporting Initiative requirements, will be reasonably well prepared, because that already encourages you to think about what are your most material impacts under ESG, what are the kind of information that you would need to be able to provide to show how you think about it, how you measure it, and how you perform against those metrics. So diversity, inclusion metrics, engagement metrics, board representation metrics, as we've talked about. And so I think for companies who've been already reporting pre the regulation and directives coming in, they should be in a reasonable place. That doesn't say it's not a big step up for a lot of organisations to make sure you're reporting now in line with those requirements as they come in under the CSRD framework. And then there are other requirements coming down the line, as mentioned, on due diligence. So due diligence in supply chains and how you make sure you can evidence your processes, learn from your processes to make sure that the due diligence that you're doing is effective. And so I think companies that are responsible and are doing that work, the challenge is in not necessarily adapting practice as much, but making sure that you report in a way that meets a limited assurance standard. So the burden of proof is going to be greater for organisations, and being prepared is going to be important. So there's lots of conversations across companies about how you do that, how you structure yourself for best effect to do it. And those that have been reporting historically will be ahead of the game in that regard, or at least reasonably well prepared, I would suggest. It brings the opportunity, though, because there is a formalisation of frameworks, to just look internally again about whether you've considered all of those impacts in the right way. Are you doing enough in all areas that you need to consider? Are you focused on the right areas as an organisation? So from an Upfield perspective, we've taken the opportunity to relook again from a double materiality perspective. So that's our impacts on the outside world and the outside world's impacts on ours, to consider which of our topics are genuinely most material. How are we going to explain to our broad set of stakeholders how we perform, how we manage those risks, and for us, how we capture and think about the opportunities as well, because the existing frameworks are reasonably risk-based, but from our perspective, we think about it in terms of the positive impact and opportunity that we have to shift the system as well.
Something that you mentioned there about, how do you explain these kind of things or to your stakeholders, it points to something else that I want to talk about, because obviously, regulatory accountability is only just kind of one type of, it's sort of formalized accountability, and companies are, as you say, accountable to many, many different groups of stakeholders. You've got workers, you've got management, you've got investors, you've got consumers. What, Sally in particular, I think to start with, and actually you touched on this earlier in that, consumers to a certain extent are always going to be driven by price and, things like that. What are the big tensions that you see between the social priorities of those different groups in the work that Upfield does?
I think it's a really interesting question to kind of consider. I think I don't necessarily see tensions within it. What I see is people. So investors are people who are driven by, yes, some of the financial returns, but increasingly they have reporting requirements in this space as well. Our employees are people with families and kids for whom they hold hope for the future. We have suppliers who employ, hundreds of thousands of farmers who have needs and expectations and challenges of their own. And so how you understand those day-to-day challenges, whether from a consumer perspective, a chef's perspective, a farmer's perspective, become crucial to how you adapt and continue to grow as an organisation. So when we think about how do you understand what those challenges are, I think the notion of how you understand those voices, those views and opinions, those stakeholder needs in your ecosystem, frankly, if you ignore them, you're going to run into problems as an organisation. Those relationships are really critical. Good relationships with your suppliers, good relationships with your employees. So whether it's through very formal processes that allow people in your value chain to raise issues like speak up lines or grievance processes, or whether it's more informal processes around engagement and worker voice, works councils, or for example, we've got a youth advisory board in Upfield to try and make sure we're pulling through different opinions from different generations on what we do and how we do it. And when we start on our sustainability strategy on how we think about ESG, we ask all those stakeholders what they think is most important. So it isn't just about our interests. Those frameworks encourage you to think about other people's interests. So you have to think about some of those tensions. If you get one interest overriding others, you're not going to maintain robust, consistent delivery, service, supply chains for very long. So you have to work with your value chain.
Coming to Diane, kind of bouncing off that last point, given that a lot of the work that you do is advising companies on how to sort of navigate quite complicated or complex ESG issues, how does this question of the broader benefits for the company at large of engaging with these kind of things correctly come up? And not to say that regulatory compliance is the low-hanging fruit, but what are these sort of extra benefits that you find companies get when they start engaging with this in the correct way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of businesses are and have been for a period of time. So although you've got this holistic grouping now of E, S and G together, the areas that sit under them, as Sally's been discussing, they're not new. They've already been there. There's already been a focus on them. So a lot of this is coming together under this holistic umbrella, but the activity has been there for a long time. The business purpose has been there for a long time. So lots of it isn't new. The reporting bit may look different, but actually lots of the activity isn't new. And I think just in relation to that, what that then means is that businesses for a long period of time, if we go back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for a long period of time, they might have chosen 4 to focus on internally within the business. So they might have looked at gender equality and they might have looked at health and well-being within the business. But externally, they may well have been looking at, well, how can we progress those UN Sustainable Development Goals in collaboration? So we've seen really good examples of collaboration if we look at work that, for example, WaterAid does, and it will be working with the pharma industry when it's looking at clean water and sanitation. It will be looking potentially at the tech industry and how they can come to support wider societal issues on health and well-being or clean water, and lots of different businesses depending on their sector. And we've discussed the food sector and the issues there, but actually lots of sectors are looking beyond their own business and mission into that broader purpose and how they can use their collective skill sets to make a difference. And I think from a legal profession perspective, the way we're doing that and we're collaborating with other private practice or other in-house communities is we're looking at how can we support crisis issues as they arise, be they issues around refugee crises or other areas. How can we actually support using our skill set, wider issues that may exist in society using those technical skills? And just like that, other businesses are doing huge amounts of work beyond their immediate purpose to their own profit and gain. So I think that is already happening across a number of businesses.
Something I always like to ask is, because sort of none of these issues are, as you say, company specific, and also a lot of them are things that can only be achieved kind of collectively. Something I always like to ask is examples of businesses that you just think are doing really good work in any of these areas. So, do you have any that come to mind?
Yeah, so I'd call out a whole range of our partners, Rachel. So because we're in food supply chains, we have some fantastic partners with our suppliers and with NGO partners on the ground who are trying to affect positive change, and we are very privileged to be able to partner with them. So, programs like we've got a partnership with a company called Ag Ventures in Kenya to grow local canola, to support a brand like Blue Band, employing local farmers and supporting them with good agricultural practices. So we get the benefit of a local supply chain that supports the local economy and local people. We get to support some great suppliers directly and be the purchaser of the raw materials as part of a beneficial economic model where everybody in that benefits. The supplier benefits, we benefit, the farmer benefits from the creation of that solution. And at the end of the day, the consumer benefits from having a great product that they know comes from local farmers. And that's replicated here in the States, excuse me, actually in New Jersey at the moment with our US team. They've got fantastic partnerships. It is super early. It's super early. But yeah, yesterday the US team were out with partners at the retailer end of things, so partnering with one of our grocery retailers, with a local food bank in New Jersey. Earlier in the year, they'd been planting food as part of a food bank, understanding where food comes from in supply chains and connecting there. And then yesterday, they've literally been kind of working as part of the food bank in food preparation to support thousands of meals for people in need here in New Jersey. So we know that our business, that people like getting out and connecting as a team with their communities. They want to be part of that. And those collaborations, they're of huge benefit in terms of the way in which we work with our retail partners going forwards. We do the same thing with chefs, with farmers. It's incredibly kind of the humanity of it, I think, is what always comes out. The people that we have in companies, in suppliers, in supply chains. We talk about S as some kind of amorphous set of standards, but at the end of the day, it's people, right? We're talking about people.
So there's a lot there that I actually want to return to, but Diane, is there any kind of companies that you want to give a sort of shout out to that you think are doing really well, or that sort of
it's a little bit harder for me from sort of a naming client perspective, but I'll go back to a couple of things. I think, you know, that Water Aid event that I mentioned, you know, what the focus of that discussion was on the good health and wellbeing discussion. And actually, you know, we had a number of people speaking. So if I mentioned, we had Dame Sally Davis, she was there, she was talking about antibiotic resistance. And then we had other panelists. So we had a panelist from the finance sector, we had a panelist there from the pharma sector, and from other sectors. And what they were doing was talking about how they were supporting health from that perspective. And another area of work I've done a lot in across my career has been around education, working with universities and further education colleges. And really they're doing a lot of work both within country, but also for broader communities in terms of bringing education and the benefit education can have on progressing lives of their students, but also the wider community, and also exporting that education to support communities beyond their local boundaries. So that's another area. So I see that we've got some amazing work going on through different sectors that we're working with.
And so, yeah, to touch on something that both of you mentioned there, which is kind of cross-company and cross-sector links. You know, companies do not exist in isolation. They sit atop and sort of within very complicated webs of various relationships. Again, my experience of this is predominantly on the climate side, and, you know, the way in which you track emissions flowing kind of upstream and downstream. How do you navigate your sort of, Sally, I guess, starting with Sally, I guess, your responsibility in that, both in terms of, so you've spoken about kind of suppliers, but also then to kind of consumers, like how far does, where should companies' responsibility sit in terms of social issues, in terms of them existing in a chain?
So I think for me a lot of it comes back to partnerships. So clearly all companies, all members of those value chains have responsibilities to operate well, to be responsible. And if you're not, I think you'll get caught out eventually. People's trust in your brands, the way in which you behave and operate, will come into question. So it's really important that the promise that you're providing and the service provision that you give, you live up to. So where we've got, you know, brands that offer a heart health benefit, you know, Proactive that has lower plant sterols, we have to make sure they're scientifically at a level where we can genuinely prove that if you eat it, it's going to have a benefit for your heart. We can't make a claim, either from a regulatory perspective, but also from a standing over what you mean perspective, to a consumer to say that this can help as part of your diet to manage issues like cholesterol, and that service offering that you provide. When we think about a brand like Blue Band, which we sell in places like Indonesia, in Sri Lanka, in Kenya, it has the right levels of nutrition under WHO standards to say that it is a really important part of the nutrition that supports childhood growth and development. So when we partner with schools and we partner with nutrition experts, we can say to parents that this is a product that will genuinely help your children grow because it contains the right nutrients to support that in terms of the quality and availability of the product on the shelf for the consumer every day. So it's for me, it's really important that for us to be credible, we partner in a way that we can explain our claims clearly, the product offering we have, the performance and benefit that it gives in a way that's credible. So where we make heart health claims, we frequently partner with heart health associations and get them to challenge, really challenge us on whether we meet the right standards to be able to say what we want to be able to say, and that product will indeed deliver the benefit that we want to be able to talk about with consumers.
And so Diane, from a more kind of, I guess, observing or advisory perspective, have you seen any shifts in the way in which companies kind of are envisaging their position in these kind of long chains? Is that something that is changing? What are the factors kind of going into that?
In terms of supply chain, is that what you meant?
Just in terms of yes, supply chain, but also more broadly, the fact that, companies exist in these kind of big webs.
Yeah,
I'll
go with the second part. Yeah, I think businesses have been looking at that for some time, and I think they've got to. And we've been hearing there about kind of the importance that are taken to verify all of the claims that they're making in terms of how does this link with nutrition, how does this link, and how does that sort of scientific verification sit there. I think businesses have been looking at this, but it doesn't always go right, does it? We've got to go back to, you've got to look at the strategy, you've got to look at the vision, you've got to then within that look at leadership conduct, leadership commitment to the statements, leadership commitment in terms of actions, but also, and it was an earlier point that we picked up there as well, the openness to identifying risk, because talking about risk and identifying risk and listening to the voice when it comes to you is uncomfortable. But very often that voice that, Sally was discussing, people telling you in a speak up line, people telling you there's a problem, they're to know problem. So actually what I think businesses are doing more, and regulation sometimes forces this, whistleblowing regulations force it, is you do need to listen to the voices when they speak. And I think what we see when you don't listen to voices when they speak, and even if you've got the right policies and frameworks in place, things go wrong. And we saw that, didn't we, from a diversity and inclusion perspective around Me Too. Many sectors, industries, organisations affected will have had policies and procedures, but people weren't speaking up and people weren't using the grievance procedures, or if they were, they weren't heard in that way. So businesses have been learning, I think, in recent years with social media and that voice coming from wider society as well as their workforce. They've been learning about the changes that they need to make, and they've been actively responding, as well as looking at that broader strategy, which was always high on the board agenda. But the S factors are something which, again, have to be looked at in that wider context, always looking at the social impact of a decision. And perhaps the regulatory side of measuring E or measuring G has meant that S has looked rather soft, but in fact it was never soft, it was always hard. And we need to just make sure that that's front of mind as well when people are looking at their impact.
Do you think social movements like Me Too, obviously that had a big impact on the way in which companies thought about, as you've said, sort of diversity and also sexism and sort of gender imbalance problems within them? Do you think that that's had an impact on sort of other social issues, in that because the Me Too movement is great, but from a company perspective, you don't want it to be, we've been caught out doing a bad thing and now we're going to overhaul our procedures. You want to have not done the bad thing in the first place. So do you think it's had an impact on kind of other social issues as well as gender-based ones?
I think generally things have moved very fast. Traditionally, all businesses and all areas of society have perhaps been reliant on government or legislation to make change. Historically, that's perhaps where it has been. But all of this has meant that people have to be far more dynamic. And people do things, don't they? Businesses get things wrong, all businesses, all sectors. And the real point here is around the learning that comes from that. And so the learning that's coming from that is people are looking at how do we listen to the voice, and the voice then that you listen to, the worker voice or the community voice, can raise a whole range of issues. And if you've got that open listening and you've got a mechanism within board level and at strategic level to address the risks that are being flagged, then that will change businesses. And businesses will, all businesses will have issues. That's always going to happen, but it's the response to it. And it comes back to your earlier question, I think, around proactivity and reactivity. Reactivity is always going to be quite late. And quite often regulation is quite late. It comes in after there have been issues. So the real point here, and this is what we were hearing before, businesses have already, long before the new directive coming in, they've already been reporting. They've been looking at higher global standards. So in that way, a lot of businesses are very well prepared.
Yeah, that's really interesting and useful. Thank you. We are now in our final minute and a half. So just want to ask you both if there's something you want to sort of touch on briefly that we haven't got to, or indeed if you have any questions for each other.
I think we've probably touched on everything I would. Just to say, it's been a really interesting conversation from my perspective, and I think my last reflection is just about that balance between getting caught in the regulation and losing sight of the human conversation, which in all of these organisations, it is just people. The S is about people and how we operate, how we treat each other, the way in which we have conversations about how we improve our relationships. And I think that point about learning is key. I see that everyone's learning. The regulators are learning how to regulate better in this space because we realise there's gaps. Companies are learning how to operate in a more transparent way as that requirement comes to the fore and to address the issues as they come up.
Great, thank you. Diane, do you have anything you quickly want to add at the end?
No final comments from me.
Well, in that case, thank you so much for joining me and for a very interesting discussion. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sorry, Sally, that you had to get up at such an ungodly hour, as it turns out.
That's all right.
Great. So, yes, thank you very much. And I think we will sign off now. So.